This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And it is September the 20th. And we're talking about community action and how you get underway with ideas. You start with one or two people and gradually accumulate some people and eventually get to have an organization, and that's not as simple as it might sound. So we've been looking at various aspects of it. This week, the Natural Areas Study Group was going to Vermilion County. So I got smart and decided to write a trail guide for the virtually the trail that they'd been taking. They would be going to Vermilion County. They have the choice of going on 74 to Forest Glen, or they could go 150 and drop off at various spaces. I had to confine myself to the fact that they would not stop. They would be taking a little bit longer to go on 150. But there are features that should be known to people who sometimes don't know them. And there's a new bridge, and we wanted to at least locate it. They decided to go by 74, which is good because it was a fairly long field trip. And so the trail guides are not a loss. It will be there for future reference. It needs pictures, it needs cross-sectionals, some graphs and charts, and might be, somebody suggested it might be helpful to have a mole to look up the area and run along it. We could have someone who has a mole camera that goes up in the sky and looks down on our corridor. It seems that it's better than doing a satellite feed, which we can also do. And it was broken into two pieces in a way. One of our real problems is that we need connectivity. If you have rail trails that go across the country and they break down at certain points, then once people use them and come across the section that doesn't work, then they don't tend to use the rest of it. So we have a real problem of getting Kickapoo Trail traffic through to Champaign. And the Natural Area Study Group was leaving from Need a Purpose Center and Broadway, and so they could follow some of our problems. One of the simplest answers would be to have a rail parallel to the trail, or the trail parallel to the rail. It's often done, especially in urban settings. Sometimes when an adjacent railroad line that might have been a different company has vacated, there's also some real estate that allows you to do that without being too crammed up on the railroad line, the active railroad line. We have one problem with that is at University Avenue and Lincoln is a very hard section to cross with bicycle. The railroad goes across at a diagonal. If you're in Europe, in some situations, they will have lights, and if you're on the diagonal, bicycles go first. We could possibly do that. It would be costly, but it would also give some realization to the traveling public that bicycles count. And sometimes how bicycles haven't counted. We have people get into a car and go 3 miles, but you could have gotten onto a bicycle and gone 3 miles and had a carrier to put your whatever you bought in. You could even walk that amount. So the state has upgraded this situation so that bicycling is and hiking is regarded as a form of transportation, and that's the same way as somebody getting into a car. It used to be that if you weren't going to put in a transportation remodeling, 100% of the remodeling, especially if it was on a state highway or federal highway, would be 100%. But the parallel bicycle way would be 20%. So it's been pointed out to the state that this is not justified. This person on a bicycle has every right to be there as much as someone in a car. So it's come to be that if a rail trail or bicycle way is put in, if it's justified, it gets state and federal money 100%. You don't have to have the community put in all their money to make it work. That's been a problem because there hasn't been that sort of money for bicycle ways. And once again, if you're going through an urban situation, you have to have good connectivity. And I think it might be costly, but if you go back 100 yards and put up a bridge over Lincoln Avenue and University Avenue, that would probably be the cheapest way in the long run. You'd have to have it rather high. It has to take major vehicles like cranes or fire trucks and the like. So you couldn't have it low, mainly for buses and cars and semi-trailers. It would have to be high, but it is doable. And so we need some engineers with some ingenuity to start dreaming about a bridge over University Avenue and Lincoln Avenue. I think that would be better than having lights and having bicycles get a start across at a grade level, because vehicles aren't attuned to bicycles yet. The bicycles don't exist for most travelers that are using cars, and that sometimes causes problems. It can cause problems when a semi-trailer gradually moves sideways and you have a bicycle on the roadside and it gets squeezed into the edge. So it's something you have to think about. So grade crossing might be all right if there were lights and if the traveling public were tolerant enough to allow bicycles to go across beforehand. That means you also have to have some traffic. You have to, you're not going to have a bunch of lights that go on and off and there's no bicycles going to go through or no hikers. So to some extent, this depends on usability. We don't have a sample of usability at the moment because no one finds it easy to get across from Urbana to Champaign. And that's separate from the Kickapoo Trail. But we have some awkward situations. And I would like you to look at that seriously. It's not impossible to dream across a bridge. It's not impossible to dream that we have a set of lights. We've had to deal with roundabouts recently. people have come to stop signs and lights, and they've replaced them with a roundabout. And that hasn't gone down very well. In some places where they've been suggested, it's been pulled out because public didn't like it. But some countries actually have them everywhere, and there's jurisdiction for it. So you don't have too much choice. But there are probably countries that have more overall federal control rather than each state having its own way of doing things. That's part of our problem here. But we do have a national rail to trail conservation movement, and they know about these things, and gradually bicycles will get more respectability. They used to be respectable until cars hit the deck, and it was more convenient, and you could, instead of going 5 miles to a natural area, you could go to Colorado and ski or whatever. So it's very, very convenient and helpful to have your car, but it's also locally, especially important to have your bicycles. It's just important to have the exercise that goes with bicycles. Time and time again, we're getting told that we shouldn't be sitting all day, and we shouldn't be sitting in a car all day, and to have your bicycle with you, whether it's on the back of your car or on top of your car or wherever, you can transport it to some place and use it. And it's good for your exercise, good for your body, good for your brain. And so think about our main glitch in getting a rail with a trail. There's room there because there used to be more than one railroad line. And also each railroad has a width of right-of-way, and you can put it on the right-of-way. And if necessary, you can put a fence up between the trail and the rail, so nobody gets onto the railroad line. Makes it a little bit more crass, but it's safe. So if there's an engineer or an architect or a planner or a landscape designer that would like to look at the rail bed between Kickapoo and Champaign, then I'd like to think about that. We have some alternatives perhaps, but they go further south, across on Windsor Road perhaps. Some people do that, but Windsor Road can be a speedway sometimes. And if you have a bicycle way, there's no real assurance that nobody's going to run onto the bicycle way. So there's room to the north. So I am taking my natural area study group out Broadway, and you go along to the hospitals, and both hospitals have railroad bed. Carl has rail bed in front of it. Provena has space behind, and it's not even easy to suggest that in theory and try to work it out with the railroad companies, who don't always enjoy the company of trail people. But this particular railroad bed is relatively inactive. It's to the yards. It's Norfolk Southern, comes in from Bloomington and goes to Banner, and it's active. But for minor supplies of plastic to Solo Cup or what replaced it, and it's there for storage of rail cars and special equipment that may be used in the future. They need space for railroad lines for the replacement of stick rail. They need space for railroad ties and gravel and ballast materials. So they need that yards. I hope they keep it because it is part of the railroading system, and we like the railroads too. So as you come from Broadway, you're looking at the about a block south. You see the railroad going through south of Leal Park. And there is space there, and there is connectivity because you can park a car there and get onto the railroad and go east or west. And the railroad goes in front of Carl, and that's okay. So I was encouraging my natural area study group to think about that portion of the trail. They could even think more imaginatively or more extendedly to Champaign. If once you do get across the Lincoln University glitch, then there's room behind Provena, and you come to small roads. Washington is one, and already we have an underpass at on Washington, where you can go under the Canadian National. And there's been a little railroad line that allowed freight from Monticello to come through. It was an old Illinois Central line, separate from the Norfolk Southern, and it comes through about level with the Champaign Post Office, and then waddles around and goes south on the main line. It used to be that that train would come in and it would back down that railroad line and push the cars that were brought in north to the railroad yards, the Canadian National Railroad yards, so that they could be joined on to another train or a manifest train with different materials, or if it was a whole train full of grain coming in from Seymour and Bonneville, that could be okay. There was a derailment because these railroad beds weren't always kept in shape. The derailment was between State and Randolph. And that was a Big Four depot area. And there's a lot of lawn there at the moment. The Wabash line, which was owned in that area differently from Norfolk Southern, is an open space, which could be a venue for a number of different interesting people. You could bring bicycles together, but you could bring all sorts of things. You might even have a dog run, or you could have venues at a certain time of the year and have a fete with 100 participants or whatever. So we're looking at that. It's not easy to do that because that would mean that the public would have to buy the corridor. And the railroads aren't stupid, as they're going to charge an arm and a leg for the Wabash line. The rails have been taken out, the ties have been taken out. There's a little spur which goes on to the Canadian National, mainly because functional railroad cars need to get back up. Working teams need to back their themselves up sometimes if there's a train coming through. So they do their work on the railroad and then back off while the train goes through, and then they're back on again. So you need a spur like that, and that's been retained. But really, if you get to the Champaign end, you can find ways to get to the Big Four area. Now, the material that comes in from Seymour and Bonneville and Kraft and some plastic, and that comes in and it jumps over onto the Norfolk Southern line. There's a connection there. And if you wander over there, you can see where the connection is. So the Wabash has been retired. It's still there. You can see it. It's narrow, but it's viable. One of the problems is that it cannot be bought easily because it means debating with Canadian National. And at the moment, the emphasis is on keeping passenger trains on the rails. The passenger trains are often put onto a siding because that freight train that has a mile and a half of rail cars, whether it's energy or whether it's grain or manifest train with a whole lot of different products, that's worth millions of dollars. And it also takes a lot of energy to stop it and start it off again. So the passenger train is it is not earning its own way. It doesn't have enough people to pay for itself. So it has to be subsidized. The freight train is paying for itself. There's no subsidy for that. Probably some subsidy for putting in the railroad in the first place, but it's an asset that's already there, and you can park your passengers and have them sit for half an hour while the train goes through, and doesn't have to stop and brake and start again. So that's the west end of Champaign. That's where you want to reach. You want to also know that if we're putting historic trains in at that site, then you have to have some way of getting in there. So that means we're re-railing between Whiteheath and Seymour, which is abandoned. And so we have the arrangements for doing that. It'll take a long time to do it, but then it gets to Seymour. The Seymour, Bonneville, and Staley, that section of the Canadian National, which used to be Illinois Central, is being abandoned. And cleverly, the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad Group has decided to challenge that abandonment and keep the rail intact, and the elevators, which have crawled off the railroad because the rental is, if you want to get rid of an elevator that's small and only giving you a few cars, then you put the rent up high, and that means that rent from those elevators goes on the road to taxpayer disadvantage because the freight rate on roads doesn't really pay its way in taxes. So we're trying to get those two elevators back on the railroad line. That may mean that we're probably facing $3 million between Bonneville, Seymour, Bonneville, and Staley. We want the tracks intact because it takes a lot to do it after they've been demolished. So it's sitting there at the moment. It has a railroad breaker on it, so if a train goes past Staley, it falls off the line. So it's not being used, but it has potential. Now, the next piece is, how do you get that train into the venue place we're talking about between State and Randolph? Well, that means you have to have a pilot system and a different way of talking to the federal government about railroads. So it's not going to be easy to get the Champaign, Havana, and Railroad, Champaign, Havana, and Western Railroad into Champaign so that they can bring historic trains in from the Monticello Railroad Museum. Not everyone at the museum would be happy about that either, because that's 25 miles and people can get bored on 25 miles. So you have to have some reason for coming in. You may have to have some drama at Bonneville, or you have to have a interurban depot that you can show people, and or you have Prairie or something that keeps children especially interested and active. You might have to paint a building or two and do something that upgrades the community to make it work. Well, that's not a bad idea, but the argument with Canadian National at the moment is about what do we do with the people movers that are put on a siding to wait for freight trains to go through. Well, the answer is to put back the second track. There was always a second track, but at the time, roads had gone in, and there was not as much rail traffic. There was not as much maintenance. There were derailments, and it was very lucrative to take out the second track and use it for steel or for re-railing other places. And it might even be that some of that money went into multinationals of other styles. So we're talking about a lot of politicking here. So we can't talk about buying the Wabash line. It's probably about a mile and a half. And the venue over by the Big Four depot, now owned by Norfolk Southern. And we have to dream about being able to bring a historic train in and actually putting a train on the Norfolk Southern and taking it to Mahomet or across to Urbana. But in order to do that, you have to realize that there has to be people involved, and the people have to know what they're doing. And there is a massive amount of paperwork. If you take someone on a 5-mile journey as historic people or people who are interested in tourism or interested in riding the train, they have to go from A to B and from B back to A. That's historic. You can't get people to go on to A and get off at B. That's making you a commercial railroad. And that means you have to have a certain degree of quality of the rails. You have to have the journals on the cars so that they will run at speed. You have to have people in the background who will know how to run a train. You probably won't be able to use too many steam engines because they have boilers. You have to have people who have boiler status to be able to run a boiler. And you have to have the money to provide the energy. It used to be coal and then there was oil, but you can actually use up a whole ton of oil in an afternoon of railroading. And so the modern historic early diesel engines were diesel electric. So you had a substantial engine which produces electricity, which then runs motors, and you have several bogies. And there are wheels, there might be 3 different sets of wheels. So you can get away with that sort of motor because it spreads the weight. If you have a steam engine that has a huge drive wheel and the weight is on a point on the railroad, then you are requiring a very good quality rail. If that heavy wheel comes to a joiner and it pushes one part of the rail down, and then the other part will be raised up, and that heavy wheel will bump into the next rail and break it. So if we do get trains into Champagne, they may be with historic diesel trains that were invented in perhaps the 1940s and replaced steam until steam probably ran until 57 or something like that. But you have to have people who can run that equipment. So, okay, we're looking at a venue, perhaps 100 years time, might be better than that if we get our act together. It might mean money to buy the venue area. Again, in competition with the debate about the people movers getting to Chicago without having to pull off and let freight trains go through. You have to think about that. So that West End has to have some attention before we get there. So we've been talking about the Kickapoo Trail, and then where do you go? At the moment, the Kickapoo Trail more or less ends at Walmart. There's a route 130, which runs through by Walmart and goes down to Villa Grove. That is wide and dangerous to get across. So a lot of our trail traffic starts at Walmart. Walmart has given in the northwest corner, next to the railroad bed, a parking space for people who want to park their cars. Now, if you want to go to Urbana, you have to cross that Broadway intersection and go about a third of a mile to Main Street, which comes out onto 150. So I, with Evil Mind, is wanting to have the Natural Area Study Group look at this whole area and see how we can have an alternative or a direct way through a rail with trail. The Main Street, that is where the rail trail terminates at the moment, but it's narrow and it doesn't have room on either side for widening for odd buds and sods. So the headquarters or the head for the trail is not at the Main Street end. It's about a mile down Main Street to Weaver Park, and it's nice little area where you have toilets and you have picnic tables and you have some old forest and a prairie, and it's popular. So that is the convenient headquarters at the moment. Most headquarters to trails are at the terminal point. Now, let's look at the area between coming back. We're looking at the area between Walmart and Aldi's, where the trail finishes at the moment, another half, 3/4 of a mile to the terminal. The Forest Preserve owns part of the old CSX, the Conrail area, up to Dobbins Drive. So you don't recognize it because it's grown over with trees, but in some places the rail is still there. And then from Dobbins Drive to the railroad yards, there is a pigtail. Let me explain what a pigtail is. A railroad pigtail allows the railroad yards, which have closed out the main line from there to Danville, but they've kept a mile so that you can push a freight train back and then put, especially if it's a manifest train, you can push or pull freight cars into various sidings. In the case of this particular 1 mile, a Smith's Road has been put through, and the Smith's Road just happens to be right opposite the Weaver Park headlands, and that's very convenient. It's just a block. It's a tough area to work with also because it's narrow and there's not really room for an official hike and bike trail. But if we could buy the piece of Norfolk Southern, which was the pigtail that's not being used, back to Dobbins Drive, you have a mile of railroad which could take that awkward ending at Main Street through to the Urbana Yards. And then you have the trailhead. You can go there if you want or take on. And the yards are not excessively used. It is possible to buy, borrow, beg, or steal an easement for railroad to go around the north end of the railroad bed. The yards. Already, MTD has been smart and they bought the old roundhouse where you had steam engines would be able to be garaged for the night or repaired. You would have a monstrous wheel and you could turn them around and send them in a different direction. A turntable. The Monticello Railroad Museum has just got the remnants of turntable, and it's sitting there waiting for the opportunity to put it in. Not an easy job. So MTD has been able to buy some land. It might be possible for an extension of a bicycle way through to MTD and sneak a right way through MTB yards or buses, and then go over University. Now you're looking at something to compare with the University in Lincoln Avenue. This is a more modest part of University Avenue, and you could have lights so bicyclists could go through. They could hit on a button and stop the traffic while they went through. You could also think of a bridge, a different type of bridge. It would run alongside the road until it went over, gently over the same sort of style of bridge that you would want to have if you were trying to get over Lincoln Avenue and University. But it's a safer bridge, not as complex. It doesn't have to go over the same distance, and it drops into the sanitary treatment plant area. There's a park. It goes through Ambert's Park is what the Amberts look after, and then you get the chance to go through a little bit of the park districts on the south side of the boneyard, and you get a bridge across there, and you get into the north side where the park district has its physical plant headquarters, and then you get on to Kerr Avenue, and you go to 45 or Cunningham Avenue. So Cunningham Avenue is dangerous, but there's lights there, and you can get across at Kerr onto Broadway. From Broadway, you go to Anita Purvis Center. You go north. You can stop off at Anita Purvis Center, or you can keep going around the Busey Woods, and then you're on Bradley. And at Bradley, you have lights and safety, and you can. Bradley's wide enough that you can probably have a bicycle corridor. You can shortly jump across to the south and get onto the rail with trail stunt, and or eventually move through those small streets to Washington and under the Canadian National. So none of this has really a lot to do with people going to Vermilion County, but it does really, because you need to get that connection between the end of the rail trail as it is now and Champaign. And that seems a little convoluted if you're a Bedroom community bicyclist coming in from St. Joe. It won't be fun to go north and around Busey Woods. And so we're still looking for ideas. And one of the essential ideas is to have a bridge high over Lincoln Avenue and University Avenue, or some configuration of lights which allows bicycles, if present, to go across Kitty Corner. Then that might be the simplest solution and very direct. So it's just north of the university, so you can go south if you want. So it brings us some connectivity. So I wanted the Natural Area Study Group to think about this as they leave Broadway. They go to 5 Points. 5 Points is on Vine. And if you look down there, the bridge, the railroad bridge goes across Vine, but it's narrow. So you would have to have a bridge, a bicycle bridge of its own to go across using real estate that's on either side. Not too bad. It's doable. And if you go a little further back to Broadway and to Race, you can see that there actually were two bridges for two different railroads, and the theater there actually occupies a depot. So there's connections here and interesting factors. And so we're still heading east, but this is too much for Natural Area Study Group. But I want them to be able to think about this corridor and the connectivity. And it often takes an amateur to look at this and say, we can do this. It might cost a few $1 million, but we can do this. We can do it in part. If we need a bridge over Vine Street, then we can do that. If we need a trail on the north side, we can do that. We might have to go right around the north side if we're going to have a rail with trail. And we have to convince 15 lawyers that belong to Norfolk Southern that this is a good idea and it's a worthwhile idea, and you're not going to have a whole bunch of people jumping around in their yards. How do we do this? There's been sidings there that provide oil and asphalt, and so there is some activity there. There's some broken down rails. So how do we get around? Think beautiful thoughts about how you get a direct entry to Champaign and Urbana. Urbana's not too worried about too much, because they have a fairly, once you get to the headquarters, you can take Main Street, and it's much wider as it comes past the nursing home and into Urbana. So that one is doable for getting bicycles into Urbana, and perhaps even to the campus. Dennis Roberts has been on the council and suggesting that there be a bicycle way along the Busey corridor. And so that would get people into Champagne in a safe and interesting manner. Okay, so my crew is going on out on Broadway from the Anita Purvis Center. So I want them to look to the south and think about the Station Theater and the Vine Street Bridge and getting around the MTD area, having access at MTD. It'd be handy to be able to bus a bunch of kids into the MTD building and have them bicycle all the way to Danville. Then we have to look to Northwest Southern and see if we can buy, borrow, beg, or steal an easement on the north side from MTD to Smith. And then you want to buy 400 feet of Norfolk Southern Railroad pigtail, and then the Forest Reserve owns the quarter mile into the terminal, the present terminal of the Kickapoo State Park, so the Kickapoo Trail. Okay, so you have to imagine that you could then come through from Danville and with caution cross 130 and then move along the corridor to Main Street. That corridor used to be loaded with original prairie, and it's been widened and diddled with, and there's been a parallel interurban, and that's been replaced and made into a drainage ditch. So it isn't what it used to be. There's still a little piece of prairie there, but some people want to plant trees there. And we have to realize that prairie was our heritage and not trees. And if you put in a tree, you're going to, it often is in a popsicle fashion. So it doesn't create a forest edge and a forest timber and a prairie to go with it. It's not landscaped that way. So there's sorts that can happen there. There's still right of way, and the prairie is still there, only a little bit. But if you didn't mow it and diddle with it, the prairie would be back. The deep-rooted plants, especially. Okay, so that was my start to the west end of the Banner part of the Kickapoo Trail, which we don't have yet, but we have to think about. We have to think that that person from Danville can come to Smith Road and go across Smith Road to the Weaver Park headquarters and enjoy doing so. Stop off for a while. It's only 100 yards, and then get back on the rail and get to Champagne. If it's a rail with trail, the bedroom community guy on a bicycle can ride through the yards, perhaps, if we get an easement through the yards, and over a bridge, over to next door to Vine Street Bridge, and past the Station Theater to Urbana. Take off on Broadway. And there's areas behind there that would be amenable for people stopping off for a while. So you drive past the front side of Carl Clinic, over a bridge, down towards Provena, behind Provena, and through to nearly to Washington, where there's a park, and you could duck through under the Washington Bridge. So you have a fairly direct possibility, or you have an indirect waddle around the Busey Woods. So then it behooves you to think about this and come back with some ideas. And the Natural Area Study Group is the sort of people that start to think about these things, and they're very good at it. So I'm planting a few ideas. Now let's have a look at the trail otherwise. When you leave Urbana, there's a little bit of a moraine. There's a little bit of the Yankee Ridge moraine still there. There's a bunch of urban houses that have been there for a while, about a mile out of 130. You have a huge power line going through there, and so you can't have trees or vegetation near that line. It's surveilled with a helicopter, and sometimes if there's a tree growing, they can drop down a chainsaw and have the tree removed that way rather than by dumping a whole bunch of herbicide. We have problems with Roundup, for instance, or paraquat in it, and then we're getting people having Parkinson's disease, and attempts to stop that. So we're now heading east to Cottonwood, and Cottonwood, the trail nicely goes down. The pieces where you go down and across where there was an embankment, and you had to, with a car, come up and dangerously over and down on the other side. But the trains needed the embankment. So once the rails were removed, the embankment was removed so that the road to the south can be at grade level. Not great for the road, but for the rail, but great for the road, and thus dangerous. So we're continuing on. There is water that comes through there. It comes through from the Walmart area and comes under the road and heads towards 74 and under 74 and into the Salt Fork of the Vermilion. That accumulation of moisture was in a low spot. So recently the road has been raised up 2 feet, and there's better drainage. You don't have to avoid the bird bath as you come into Urbana from St. Joe, or if you go through from Urbana to Mayview, you would encounter this. Unfortunately, at that spot, we've lost some of the prairie that was there. The early ecologists, Vestal and Shelford, and later Kendi and Bliss and others have used that prairie as a demonstration of what a prairie was like, and it had the extra interurban next door, which increased the area. And so George Fell, who was a student of these early ecologists, probably honed his teeth on that prairie. He came from Rockford, and he and his wife Barbara had stood on the airport runway, or proposed runway, to say, this is prairie, we don't want you digging it up. So we should probably have somewhere a little monument for George Fell and what he's done with the Nature Conservancy. It's now worldwide, and it's his forte, and also the Forest Preserve is his forte. He put it together, but a lot of the politicians wanted to add recreation to it. So the next level of George's doing was a forest, a conservation district. So the Vermilion County is a conservation district, and the Forest Preserve still has more allegiance to restoration, and the Vermilion County Conservation Area has more allegiance to preserving things. Okay, we're looking at this prairie. So we've lost a bunch of prairie, but we've been able to plant, people seed it in. If you're going to seed it in, you have to know where your seed is coming from. We don't want a whole bunch of seed from Kansas that have been different species handled, because you have open spaces and you can put in a harvester there and gather seed. But we want prairie seed from Illinois, so Illinois gene pool. So some seed was collected from that site and put in. And you also have to know when to plant it. If you plant it in the fall, it'll perhaps have been fertilized by the native snow and grow in the spring. But it will be weedy for 5 years. And you have to know that that soil has been modified by bulldozers and high hoes, and it's not the good old Flanagan and other soils that went with the dampness that was there, and drummer. And so we need to tell people about this. We need to have some kiosks somewhere. We also need to have a pull-off there somewhere for cars that don't want to walk in from the intersection, 1 mile. Mayview Cemetery is there, and it's on a little ridge too. And it was always nice to bury your people on a ridge. And so that has history. So there's rural sociology there. And if you stand up high where early settlers were buried, you can see fulls, and you can look through the next small town, which is Mayview, to Fulls elevator. And so that's, you have contact with the people who were the early settlers. You keep going and you hope that there'll be a little bit of prairie here and there. At Mayview, the elevator has been removed. It was a wooden elevator. We helped to take it down with, we knew where the nails were, the boards were put down flat so that you could get a wall that was, if it's 10 by 2, then the wall was 10 inches thick. And you went up and it might be, you had 8 by 2, 6 by 2, 4 by 2 at the top. And that was to keep the grain from bursting out of the elevator. So we're keeping going. That's through Mayview now. We are headed for Fulls, and Fulls is a very small little community, but you have to know that people haven't had much introduction to elevators. So it would be nice to explain the elevator there, and to notice that if you take a quick run around to look at the line linearly, you can see the interurban as well as the main line. The interurban, in some cases there, has been replaced by drain. The real estate has been used for that space. Keep going, and there's areas there where the drainage had been created by removing some of the topsoil. But the topsoil that we included plants and animals that were part of the prairie, and that soil was taken to Homer Lake, and it is already growing. And it will be weedy too, but it will be there as a prairie, and a fairly genuine prairie. We keep going through to Pioneer Ground on the left-hand side. There's a little road off to the right, and the corridor, the rail corridor, and the road that followed it, and the interurban that followed it, all go through it. A node in the meandering river, and the nodes don't erode or move as much as if you have the meander. The meander, the amplitude keeps working its way into the shoulder and creating a beach. So if you want your railroad and the roads to stay around, put them through a node. If you're a local yokel that wants a straight road through St. Joe, then you got it. It was engineered so that the road would continue straight through St. Joe. Then you have commerce and industry and action in St. Joe. The restaurant at the end of the line, I think, has done fairly well with bicycles. There's been a park that's established as a headquarters there because that was the terminus for a while. The urban part of the trail has been extended through St. Joe to the east side of St. Joe. And then there's a rather wonderful 1 mile that was full of prairie. But there's in the last 10, 15 years, there's been huge development on the north side of the road. And that has inspired people to mow the weeds. They look like weeds, but they're really prairie. And there's a few little notches where they can't mow because it's not very friendly. But the prairie is still there. And I hope it will go back. And I hope that the people that watch it go back will understand it. That means we have to have interpretation and education about it. So we waddle on and I keep going. But we're at the point where we're going to go up and over a bridge at east of St. Joe, and we're going to go over the Union Pacific, and we're going to look at a potential 10 miles of prairie, 10 miles of Kickapoo Trail, 10 miles of soil that's been not too changed, not chemicalized, it's native, and there's little pockets of prairie all the way along, and we'd like to see that all the way to Oakwood. I think we're getting to the end of our show. This is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And enjoy the fact that we're working with WEFT. The 26th is the 40th anniversary of WEFT. And think about Urbana Public Television, which helps us to put this sort of thing on the show.